Welcome to the Thriving Children podcast, the show that helps parents and teachers to put the magic back in child development. Here's your host, Clare Crew.
This is episode 60 of the Thriving Children podcast. I'm Clare Crew, and in this episode, I'm speaking to global education thought leader, Charles Fadel. So a big welcome to the show, Charles. I'm hugely grateful for your time.
And so am I. Thank you so much, Claire.
So curriculum redesign is a big topic that you write and speak about. Could you start by telling us about how you became involved in this field of work?
Well, it was a long transition. My background is physics and electrical engineering, but over the decades, working first in high tech, I transitioned from technology to education technology to education policy. And I realized that there was a huge gap between what was being taught versus what was needed in real life. And I mean by real life, both employability and societal needs.
And so to me, it's pretty obvious, I think, for educators and for people, I guess, that are following along, listening into a lot of my podcasts, that the school system really needs to have some big changes, not just some tweaks, but a massive overhaul essentially. And, you know, I think that it's for two different reasons. Firstly, in my mind, it's because we really need a system that better supports children's emotional well-being. But of course, also, we need to be providing children with an education that is relevant to their lives beyond school. So as you're an expert in that area, I'd love to ask you why you think there's so much resistance to that change, why it actually isn't happening yet.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned the word relevant. That is actually our tagline. It is making education more relevant. This is what it's all about, right? An education that prepares us all for the challenges we are facing now and in the future. Now, why this is hard to do and deploy? There are several reasons at several layers. Let's talk about the political layer first. You know, it takes courage to build a cathedral that you're not going to see fully built by the time you are voted out or retire or whatever. And very often people are focused on the short-term gains that could look shinier than the reality, whether it's buying new devices or building new schools. Not to say that those are not necessary at times, but they're not a panacea. So we get into these situations where the hard part takes years and years and goes beyond a political life cycle. So that's one, the politics. And that's, of course, when the next aspect is parents. Parents are used to the education they have received, and they're not particularly well informed at times about how much the world has changed. And what was sufficient for them 20, 30, 40 years ago no longer is sufficient in a world that's more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous than ever before. And so everyone clings to what they are familiar with, but not necessarily does the courageous jump towards safety. It is actually safer to implement those changes than parents realizes. Third, you also have the bias of experts. When you ask people who've created the standards a while back to change them, they are in a sense wedded to their knowledge base. And it's very hard for them to curate effectively, to decide that this area is less important than that area nowadays. I'll give you the visual analogy of a Jenga tower. You know that game, Jenga, where you can remove blocks.
Sure do.
Right. You can remove some blocks without necessarily weakening the whole structure. You just have to be wise about which blocks to remove. And then you also have assessments, right? If we keep on assessing a narrow, diminutive segment of what's necessary for life and work, well, no surprise that we get diminutive values and views of education. And lastly, as if this was all not sufficient, we also have university entrance requirements. if they don't change, the rest of the system cannot change, because in the end, K through 12, schooling is tweaked towards these college entrance requirements. And unless universities pay attention to their unwitting role, change will be really hard.
Absolutely brilliant answer, but there's so many layers to it that it does leave me sitting here going, oh my goodness, will this ever actually happen? How do you see it evolving? Where do you think the change needs to begin, knowing that there's all those layers to the equation?
Yet several layers simultaneously, but in a staggered and wise way. In other words, change management is a process. It's not just a single event. On one side, we need to educate parents and politicians about why change matters and why staying immobile is actually more dangerous than changing. There's a campaign of sorts that needs to take place there. Then there's deep redesign work to be done at the standards and assessments level, so that when people are prepared, we have actually something to show them. It would be a shame that everyone would say yes and would fall flat because we haven't done the homework that would require 5 to 7 years to come to fruition. And lastly, the other strand would be university entrance requirements. They too have to change in sync so that they apply positive pressure on the system for change. So these things can be done, but somewhat simultaneously with the right timing.
Yeah, and I think certainly at some sites, the university entrance requirements are shifting a little bit, because I've heard of quite a few people who have an unschooling background. So they haven't actually gone and done formal schooling. They've pretty much just sort of learnt through life and through their own interests and pursuits at home. And they're getting into some of the bigger universities in the world. So I think at some sites that's starting to shift.
It is starting to shift, and that needs to be encouraged. But it also has to be brought to scale, right? So it's always nice to have early entrants, early adopters. That has to ramp up to represent the norm rather than the exception.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about children, the children who are at school right now, what is relevant to them? What skills and qualities do they really need to set themselves up for the future as adults?
That's a wonderful question. Let me describe it in two facets. The first one is what is modern and relevant knowledge. And second, what are the competencies needed to make that knowledge active and not inert? So on the knowledge side, think about how much we have paid attention to traditional knowledge and its memorization in an age of search. And increasingly, in an age of artificial intelligence, we are going to be aided by our machines. And so for that, it requires refocusing education upward in its sophistication towards what we've always wanted education to be, meaning transfer. Transfer is when, by the time you're 45, you're drawing on an education you've had when you were 7, and it's now applicable in a completely different context. That's transfer. That's the goal of an education. We, in essence, educate ourselves to be able to apply a palette of capabilities to whatever shows up in life later. Mm-hmm. So modernizing what matters in knowledge and making sure that we're applying to the higher areas of knowledge, of concepts and transfer is very critical. Which means, in return, that we have to pay really careful attention to what disciplines matter nowadays, more or less. For instance, why would we not teach entrepreneurship, wellness, robotics, and so on? Why do we have a docket so full with traditional disciplines that we do not curate to leave time and space for these modern disciplines? Even within traditional disciplines, why is it that we don't curate them for branches and topics that are more or less relevant depending on the times and the locality? For instance, do we really need as many woodworkers and land surveyors as we did 100 years ago? Well, if the answer is no, it means we may need a lot more, say, data scientists. Hence, pay less attention to trigonometry, more attention to statistics and probabilities, for instance. And that's all the knowledge side.
Yeah, it's it's massive. And I think something you touched on there as well, you know, so many things that we may have remembered learning about at school. Well, first, we might not even remember it because it's never actually come up in our real life. Or if we are in a situation where we need that knowledge, it's just not there for us. So much, I think, of what's packed in has no place. So it shouldn't actually be there anymore. But then there's a lot, as you said, different professions are going to need, I guess, different routes in the education system as things evolve and adapt in our society over time, but also that there are so many life skills and things, you know, actually, being able to manage your own finances, learning about the legal system so that you're motivated to vote, all of those kind of things really aren't even part of today's education. And that to me is quite bizarre.
It is, and they should be. It used to be that way a few decades ago, that, there were areas of high school that were dedicated to so-called practical skills or life skills and so on. But they've been short-changed for the sake of more, formal disciplines. And yet there's nothing to be ashamed about regarding these practical skills. They are absolutely needed by all of us. Shouldn't everyone be able to interpret a contract or read a legal document? Shouldn't everyone be able to manage their own finances? These are absolutely essential life skills. Oh, for that matter, cater to one's own wellness and the wellness of others, and even perhaps emergency medical response, and so on and so forth. Plenty of things of that nature. That implies, of course, again, recreating the time and space that used to be afforded to these disciplines.
Now, growth mindset is a really big thing at the moment, and I know that that's an area that you have written about. Could you maybe explain what it is and then talk about whether that's actually enough to help our students prepare for their future?
Well, growth mindset is definitely a cornerstone. Simply put, it is the ability to believe in your capabilities and act upon it. It turns out that Carol Dweck, a professor at Stanford, is the one who introduced this concept in recent years, and she is the one who has blessed my book, For Dimensional Education, with a blurb on the front cover. So I'm grateful to Carol. So yes, growth mindset is an essential cornerstone on which you can build the rest, but it's not sufficient. Yes, you have to believe in yourself, but it's just one step towards being more reflective and learning how to learn and adapting to changing conditions. That is, of course, a precondition to being able to apply your skills, meaning your critical thinking, your creativity, your communication and collaboration skills, to the knowledge you have acquired. And lastly, all of this goes hand in hand with character. In other words, your temperament, your behavior, your attitudes, your values, and so on. And those are mindfulness, curiosity, courage, resilience, ethics, and leadership. Out of these 6, you can recompose the 200 or so words that people talk about.
Yeah, and that's really nice to get your take on it, Charles, because the growth mindset thing is buzzing all around my children's school right now. And I love what it has to offer, but essentially, to me, it almost contradicts some of the things that it sits alongside, So I love what it's encouraging and nurturing and the kind of language that it's instilling in children, but it's sitting next to this very outdated curricula and way of being that is quite disempowering for children. So it's kind of like this extra layer, but you're right, it's not enough in its own right.
Right, and to make it not an extra layer, you have to, in essence, embed all of these skills and character qualities and meta-learning abilities like growth mindset into the disciplines themselves. It's not an either-or proposition, but that's why we need to pay a lot more attention to what matters on the knowledge side. So we curate and make time and space for this deep embedding of the competencies. Now, that goes hand in hand. This is the what part, but it goes hand in hand with the how. In other words, it's really hard to do all these things unless you also change the pedagogical aspects themselves. In other words, how we teach needs to change as well. And again, it's a balanced view. It's a view that supplements and augments, not that is completely 100% one way or the other. In other words, yes, sometimes lectures are an efficient way of doing it, and sometimes projects are an efficient way of doing it. And the right judicious blend of both is where it's at.
And so a big focus for us at the moment in Australia, but I'm sure it's worldwide as well, is technology. So technology seems to be where a huge amount of money is being spent. And I think a lot of hope that that's the answer to get more children engaged. That's the way to get more students prepared for their future beyond schooling. What are your thoughts on technology? And is it the answer to everything?
Well, having been a technologist myself and being the holder of 7 patents, I will not be accused of being a Luddite and being anti-technology. However, I also do not view it as a panacea. It is too easy to hope for this magical silver bullet that solves it all. So I do not think technology will ever be a panacea, but the same way it's not a panacea for any other endeavor besides education. It has its pluses and minuses. It augments and it detracts. So it is how that it is used that makes a difference. And one could say that critical thinking could be taught under a 3 with 0 technology by asking penetrating questions. But at the same time, are there things we can do with technology that couldn't be done any other way? For instance, manipulating large data sets, or simply accessing a world of information. And you are right that there's a motivating factor that comes with it, but that's somewhat fleeting. In other words, every year you'd have another jolt of that dopamine, the rush of seeing fun technology in your hands. You know, one year it's a tablet, the next year it's a virtual reality goggle, and on and on and on. That fades after a while. So it's really a question of being judicious about it and not expecting it to be a panacea.
Yeah. Everything in balance, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, it doesn't get much press to say these things because, you know, we have a system that's overloaded with information. And so the way you get clicks nowadays is by being preposterous, not by being balanced. And I think you and I are resisting that urge. So I'm grateful for your attachment to this.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's almost like, anything in education or politics in general, we love our Bandaid solutions. So, let's just throw another pot of money at that, or, let's hype this thing up to solve all of the problems. And I feel like sometimes technology is that. So it's got these amazing layers that it can bring to learning, but it's never going to fix everything. But I think it's quite convenient for there to be some big solution that the media can hype up, and we can talk, as the government about how much money we've spent on this, and that should be the answers, when in actual fact, we've just got to change the system. And then technology can be that lovely little layer on top.
Well, it should be a layer embedded, but you're absolutely right. It's very often portrayed as the solution. And but it's also because people are struggling to find something tangible. People react to the tangible, not to the abstract. And, a shiny new building or a glitzy new device are tangible. And they can be pointed to within the lifetime of a politician. Whereas deep change requiring a mindset of a cathedral builder that may not see the results of their efforts during their political life cycle. That's a hard thing to request, and yet that's what's needed.
Yeah. And so you're in Australia right now, Charles, to present at the Australian Learning Lecture. So I guess, is it your first visit to Australia, or have you been here before?
I've been here 3 times before, so it's always lovely to be back. Yeah, I love it.
So what do you see that needs to be changed in Australia? And is that unique to us, or is that very much a global phenomenon?
It's not at all unique to Australia. I think a lot of really good systems, including Australia, by the way, which has a really good system overall compared to a number of other countries, are somewhat stuck. They have maximized what can be wrung out of the present and traditional system. But to go to the next step requires a lot more. And that's a significant step function that we need to go through, very similar to what we have undergone through the Industrial Revolution 150 years ago, when we invented mass schooling. So now we have to invent mass personalization of education along with everything else we were discussing in terms of what should be taught in the first place. So Australia is by no means unique. However, Australia has already a reasonable head start, and in my opinion, could actually be a leader in this transformation. I think Australia doesn't give itself sometimes the latitude to think big enough. It is a country of pioneers and a country that could actually shine on the global stage if it were to embrace these changes.
And so I guess what can we do as a parent, as an educator, as someone who just considers himself to be an everyday Australian, what can we do to be empowered to create change within our own lives, but also, I guess, demand this bigger change and this bigger shift to evolve?
Such a profound question. Well, there are two facets to this. As a parent, first of all, love your child and nurture them. Research has demonstrated that the single biggest impact on a child's ability to succeed in life is having a caring adult in their childhood. Without that, it's a foundation that will be missing for life. So that is absolutely essential. Then there's educating oneself to parenting itself. We get a driver's license, but we don't get a parenting license. And so here we are trying to educate our children based on impressions that we have formed when we were educated ourselves without realizing whether these are still valid or not, or whether they were valid at any time prior. We just go on folksy impressions. And so being educated about parenting itself matters a great deal. Third, educating ourselves as parents to where the world truly is and where it is going. Very often, when I see commentary coming from parents, I'm surprised by how low level they are, in the sense that they're not particularly demanding. They're asking for small things that should be a check mark along the way. They're not realizing how much the world is changing. And even if they do within their careers, somehow they don't translate that to the needs for their children to be better prepared for a world that is vastly changing and at an accelerated rate. So as parents, from a narrow family perspective, there are all these things that can be done. Then there's the engagement side. The engagement with the schools, and we're not talking about hammering the teacher about things that they're not responsible for. Yes, there are always teacher quality issues to discuss and so on. But by and large, teachers are there to deliver what governments have decided would be assessments and standards. And there's only so much teachers can do to change what is taught. They can, of course, teach better and try to embed some of these competencies to the extent they can. But there are no miracles if the docket is so full already. So parents, as they help the school and the teacher through their engagement, should keep in mind a political engagement where they clamor actually for changes via departments of education. They bring together labor and industry to apply pressure to make these changes on education systems that the world over are struggling to figure out what to do next.
Oh, brilliant. Music to my ears. And I love that you emphasised as well, Charles, the fact that as teachers, we are quite limited. I struggle to be involved in the system still because my philosophy, I guess, has evolved so much over the years that it's hard to teach in a way, in a system that I don't really agree with anymore. And I think that it's safe to say that probably about half of the teaching profession feel that same way, that they can see that what they're doing isn't in the best interest of the child right now at that moment in time, but they also know that it's not really preparing that child for success later on in life either. So I love that you've reminded everyone listening in that some of that just isn't in our control as educators.
Absolutely. You should not be taken as the frustration relief person.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to bring this wonderful conversation to a close quite soon, Charles. So I would love for you to share with those listening in where we can find out more about you and also your new book.
Well, that's very kind of you. Well, for one, we have a book called Four-Dimensional Education that is available directly online because it's for some reason not available through Amazon Australia, but anywhere else it has been. So I need to check into that. Regardless, it's called Four-Dimensional Education. It is available online directly on our website, which is curriculumredesign.org. Or if I may venture to give you a URL, is that possible, Claire?
Absolutely. And I'll also include it in the show notes. So go ahead and say it, and then I'll put it in the show notes so it makes it really easy for listeners just to click on it after and find where you're describing.
Okay, so it is the usual HTTP : bit.ly, as in bit.ly, bit.ly/4DEDU, 4 as in number 4, capital D, capital E, DU, as in four-dimensional education, 4DEDU.
And there's no way people are going to remember that, so don't panic, folks. It's in the show notes. And also, is there anything that you want to add? Is there anything that's burning inside that we haven't actually touched on?
Well, let's just perhaps recap what makes us successful in life. You know, this new success we've been talking about. And as you know, I'll be giving a lecture in Melbourne on Thursday at 6:30 p.m. at the Convention Center. We'll be talking about this new success. And this new success is about modernizing knowledge. It is about the competencies we need to acquire for life. You know, how we use the knowledge, our skills, how we behave and engage in the world, our character, how we reflect and adapt, our meta-learning abilities, all of which contribute to a fulfilled individual for a sustainable humanity. That is really our ultimate goal. Yes, employability is part of it, but we're really looking for success in life, not just employability.
Wonderful. That is such a brilliant way to end this very thought-provoking chat. So thank you hugely for your time, Charles, and I wish you well for the rest of your time here in Australia.
My pleasure, Claire, and I wish the same to all of your listeners, and you as well.
So that's the end of episode number 60 of the Thriving Children podcast. I really encourage you to look more into Charles's work, and until next time, be kind to yourself.
Thanks for listening to the Thriving Children podcast. For even more goodness, visit thrivingchildren.com.au.